Hi, in this film I want to talk to you about starting to ink up my tree for real, but before I get on to doing that I must just first of all apologise if the sound quality is a bit odd. We have an absolute torrent of rain at the moment and it's all crashing down on the roof of my studio, so apologies for any rain noises, and let's get looking at the inks. So I've got some inks mixed out on the plate here, and I've got a grey, a white and a blue, and this is the point where I'm going to start sounding like Bob Ross. I don't know if in the UK Bob Ross has made it onto the BBC, BBC 4 if you're interested. So the inks are all mixed from the same colours, just different quantities. And I've got white here, which is white with a little bit of extender, and I've put extender into it because I'm going to put another coat of that white onto my tree. Once I've spoken to you about the ink, I'm going to show you the printed so that you can see how these colours refer to it. So that's white with a bit of extender in it. This grey is a mixture of phthalo blue and burnt umber. It's exactly the same mix of paints as I've been using for the rest of the print. It's just tipped over to a more neutral grey by adding more brown. When it comes to mixing greys, I always work with colours rather than with black and white to make a grey. If you use black and white to make your greys, it's a slightly dead colour. It's sort of the grey that results is very flat. So I would normally, my go-to for grey is blue and brown. And that's, if you remember that when I was talking about inks and I said it's fine just to have the primary colour in black and white, and then I said the first other colour I got was a brown, that's why I went for brown, because it's a really useful colour for mixing greys and tipping other colour mixes just off that kind of bright synthetic into something a little more subtle and natural. So brown is a useful colour for that. I also mix greys using purples and yellows, greens and reds a little bit. So my advice would be, if you want greys, have a real experiment with it. And you can come up with some amazing warm greys, cold greys, neutral greys, what have you. When periodically I get asked by children, they say to me, what's your favourite colour? Because they like meeting an artist, and that's one of the questions they ask. And I'm always a bit tricksy because I always say grey, because grey can basically be any colour. So yeah, experiment with your greys. So this is a blue-brown grey mixed up again with extender, and this is going to start dropping the darker parts of the branches into my tree. And then this blue over here, which is that's phthalo blue and extender and a touch of the brown and blue mix there. This blue is much brighter. This is going to do the shadows in the foreground. And if you join me for the film where I was putting the shadows in the background, you'll notice that this is a much brighter blue. And that's because of distance. The thing to remember about distance is kind of everybody knows that things are paler in the distance and they get darker in the foreground. That's the sort of perceived wisdom. But actually it's a little bit more complicated than that, because it's more to do with how colours in the distance are muted and tonal values are muted. And as you come forward to the foreground, so colours are brighter and contrasts are more dramatic. So you can have a darker background and foreground and the picture still have distance in it. It's just that the brighter, paler foreground will have more contrast and brighter colours in it. So again, when you're thinking about distance, don't just think about, oh, it's in the distance, it should be paler. You should actually be playing with the contrast and the muting and brightening tones to experiment with that. So the other thing I need to do is to pop a bit of dryer in, because I've forgotten about that. So let me just mix in a touch of dryer. Again, I'm not going to bother with dryer here because this is a thin sheet of very extended ink I'm going to drop onto the area of the foreground. Here the ink is a little bit thicker and I just want a tiny bit of dryer in there just to help things along. So let's just put that in. When you're using dryers or anything like that, just take the time to really have a good mix. I know that sounds obvious, but it's so easy when you're swept up in the excitement of wanting to get on with a print to just not take as much time as perhaps you need. Now, for this tree, I'm going to ink up in a slightly different way. Before, when I've been doing inking up, I've been using bleeds of colour on the roller, where I've got it going from light to dark across one roller. Now I'm going to do a bit of painting with little rollers. And I talked about these wire rollers before. These little economy wire rollers, you can get them quite easily. They're quite widely available. Again, if you want supplier lists, then I've got them in the resources section of my website. I've got, they're mostly UK understandably, but if you're in the States there is the ever wonderful McLean's, but I'm sure there are plenty of other places as well. So now I've got my dryer mixed in and I've just pulled a thin amount of ink to the foreground and I'm just going to ink up. So again, look how I am pulling that ink down from the reservoir there, and I'm just using a very thin coating. I can always come back and get some more ink if I need it. I would far rather be running to and fro and doing lots of working with the roller than putting too much ink on at once. So this pure white is going to go onto the trunk of the tree and it's just going to add another layer. I just want some wet ink to blend with the grey, which is why I'm putting yet another layer of white on. And the shadow layer, I'm using my hawthorn roller here, and I'm using a sort of a roller with a big fat dimension on it because the shadow area is a larger area to ink than the tree, and so I'm going to resort to a nice soft roller because it's going to give me easier coverage. A softer roller like this will always be better at giving you an even coverage, and with those shadows that I want to put on the landscape I need a fine even layer, so hence me using the hawthorn roller and not using yet another little red wire handled roller. So now I've inked up with the mixes of ink that I showed you on the slab, you can see the results. Excitingly, it's the first time that I've seen the tree completely printed, because if you remember, my advice is always, if you can avoid inking detail until the colour you need on the paper, do so. So now on here I've got the tree inked up and the blue shadow dropped down onto the landscape. Now it's interesting how your mind changes as you work, or at least mine does as I work, because now I've got these branches in, I have decided that I don't need to add darker tips to them. All the way along when I've been planning this, I know that there's going to be this white grey layer, and then there'll be the darker figuring up the trunk, which birches have, but I was also thinking that I was going to drop a sort of darker, perhaps slightly red tint onto the tips of the branches. But now I look at them now, I'm not going to do that, and that's really important for everyone when you're working in it. Well, anything, painting or printmaking, is kind of knowing where to stop. And I think certainly with printmaking, it's easy to sort of keep adding stuff just because you can. And sometimes it's better to back off and just leave things as they are. So I'm not going to add anything else to these tips of these branches, but I'm going to up the contrast to the tree and give it definition by putting the figuring on the trunk and into the beginning of the broader branches. The other thing that that dark figuring will do is that it will pull the tree forward because it's going to up the contrast. Like I said before, foreground wants to have maximum contrast, maximum tonal range. Background, everything needs to be much more muted. And you can see the difference between the blues, hopefully. The bright, clearer blue in the foreground and the slightly grey blue in the background here. The other thing that I should say is that it's okay not to love the print at every stage. When I teach and people are beginners, they often go through a period where in the middle of the print, when they're sort of halfway through, they lose it completely and they think it's a total disaster. And the more printing you do, the more you realise is that there's this kind of up and down to printing, where in the beginning you're kind of all enthusiastic and optimistic, and then you get into the middle section where it doesn't look like the finished end and it's the beginning bit's over, and there's this kind of period in the middle where you think, I'm not sure about this. But then as you go towards the end, so things improve. So at the moment this is too much blue and I'm not loving it, but I know that I've got all the little bits of grey rock and scuddy bits where there are darker stones to drop in here, which again, there's going to be some detail up here and detail down here. The detail up here will be muted, the detail down here will be harder contrast. So that's where we are at the moment, and in the next film I'm going to show you the actual inking up of this, to how I've arrived at this particular blend of inking. So thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me for that.